By watching this video, you will learn how to spin up a basic Angular 5 project and how to connect to an external API to grab and display data. So let's get started. We're going to start off with the normal process of creating a repository. And nothing special here. Nothing that you haven't seen before. Okay. Now, we need to create a getIgnore. Now, the getIgnore will contain a little more than what we're used to, but it's still a getIgnore. The first one we've seen, dsstore is a macOS 10 file. Syncconfig is part of my template. It's for an Atom plugin. If you don't use Atom, you may feel free to omit this. .idea is PHP storage settings. Node modules is for npm packages. You need to have npm install before starting the screencast. There is a link of how to install npm. It's operating system dependent before you get started. Now the next one is called vendor. Vendor is composer, PHP generated code. And here's some more generated code, src, start.js, and jsmap. This is actually auto-generated from Webpack. We'll discuss Webpack later in the screencast and what it generates. Public HTML dist also will be generated by Webpack, and so will the public HTML index.html. It's a little counterintuitive. We're going to ignore our index.html, but trust me, Webpack will also auto-generate this from a template, and so we want to ignore that. npm debug.log, of course, is an npm debugger log, and Webpack target.js is a dynamic way of determining the deployment path on Bootcamp Coders. We'll also have a look at that when we configure Webpack. So we'll go ahead and commit and push that. And now we have our getIgnore. Now we can just go ahead and grab the clone URL, open PHP Storm, and go ahead and check it out from version control as per usual. And now we have a new project. All right, just about ready. I'm going to go ahead and create a deployment for this. And I'm going to go ahead and rush through this because this creation of deployments is, of course, covered in the pre-work screencast. And this should be old hat for you by now. Okay, just about ready. Go ahead and test the connection. And we're good to go. And I'll go ahead and, of course, switch on auto upload. Okay, good. One more thing. I need to go ahead and SSH into the server to go ahead and create that directory because it does not yet exist. But here is where things differ a little bit. On Mac OS 10 and Linux, you want to have two terminal tabs open. On Windows, you want to have a git bash open and a putty session open. In essence, it's important to have a remote and a local session open at all times when you're developing Angular. So on Linux, I'll press Control-Shift-T, or on Mac, press Command-T, and I get a new tab on the terminal. Personal preference, but I like to have my local on the left. Local is left. And remote right. Local left, remote right. On Windows, it's going to be a little different, perhaps because one is going to be a git bash and the other, the remote, will be putty. Let me SSH in. And what I've done on the server is to create my Angular 5 example directory, cd into it, and we're going to be using this SSH session later, so I'll just leave it idle. For now, I'm going to switch back to my local. But leave the SSH session open. We will need it later. To start an Angular 5 project, we need to tell npm, the node package manager, about our project. To do that, we're going to create a file called package.json. And this tells npm about the project we're about to run, as well as its dependencies. So the first thing we have here is the name of the project, Angular 5 example, its version, its license, the author information, and some scripts. The build script is for the end user. Webpack is going to take all the code that we write and put it into an optimized and easy format for the end user's browsers to interpret. If we didn't have this, Angular would be worthless. Now, this one is actually a development or a kind of a debug instance that we're going to be working with a lot. And this is an effective way of tracking down and debugging any mistakes and see what our application does before we go to the build and give it to the final end user. The next is the repository. We're going to say that it's Git and go ahead and put the GitHub URL. The next thing we're going to see is what's known as dependencies and dev dependencies. Dependencies and dev dependencies are really technically, in the strictest of senses, sorted and done by Webpack for us. So we could have put this all into one big group and let Webpack kind of figure it out. The first part is the dependencies. And the dependencies, we're going to go ahead and say, all right, here's what we really need, which really comes down to Angular. Everything's version 5. The first are common, compiler, and core. I call these the 3 C's. And if you don't have these three, you really can't run Angular. The next is forms. They're not really using this screencast, but this allows for advanced Angular form routing. And I use this part of my template because, what application doesn't have forms. The next are platform browser and platform browser dynamic. And what these guys do is that they tell Angular how to load in an actual end user's browser. Finally, we're not going to be using this here. Kind of allude to it. But this is Angular Router. This allows you to create custom routes on an Angular application. Core.js is kind of a standard by which Angular complies to, and we need to have this in the end user's browser. Rx.js is for something called observables. We're going to see how observables work as well when we create a service. Next is jQuery. This helps us with Bootstrap scripts. And then finally, the final requirement is zone.js. Now, the dev dependencies, again, they are tools. And these are just a bunch of tools. And what do? To be honest, there are so many tools to the tools, the tools to the tools to the tools. I'm not 100% familiar myself. I just know that some tools are necessary in order for things to work. So, like types node, this just gives me a typing for the command prompt. Awesome TypeScript loader. This is what's known. Bootstrap has things called loaders. And what they are is just basically, if there's a new file type, we're going to load it. In this case, we're loading awesome TypeScript. Very awesome. There's a Bootstrap loader, which loads Bootstrap. And then we load Bootstrap itself. 4.0 beta 2, as of the time of this recording. Bootstrap's in beta, but pretty stable and pretty usable. CSS loader loads CSS. Extract text Webpack plugin. That's the other thing Webpack has. Has loaders for unknown types, plugins for additional functionality. And I'm not, again, this is one of those things I knew I always needed, but not exactly why. To be honest on that. File loader loads files. Font Awesome and Font Awesome Webpack is loading Font Awesome, so we can have little icons. HTML loader loads HTML files and PHP files into Webpack. HTML Webpack plugin manipulates the DOM using Webpack. Less and less loader. It's a prerequisite for Bootstrap. Node Sass, prerequisite for Bootstrap. Null loader, prerequisite for Webpack itself. Popper, this is actually a prerequisite for Bootstrap. Raw loader, resolve URL loader, some loaders that Webpack needs. Rimwrap is a cleanup tool that will delete the files on every build. Sass loader, style loader, again, required for Bootstrap. TypeScript is actually, we're going to be writing Angular in a language called TypeScript, and so we need to include TypeScript itself. The URL loader, required for the Font Awesome loader, and finally Webpack itself. And then we have the Webpack dev server, which we'll be using the dev server for debug, and Webpack merge will allow us to share configuration files. We are now ready to go. The next thing we need is something called tsconfig.json. This actually will configure the TypeScript compiler. This is one thing that I have actually just directly plagiarized from Angular's documentation and not given a lot of thought to. So the only options I really know about is this exclude. We're going to exclude node modules and vendor and not try to compile those. But this is really something that I kind of just include as boilerplate and just kind of move on from. And you're going to find that in the first part of creating Angular projects, there's a lot of boilerplate, and you just kind of move on. Again, this tsconfig is just a direct plagiarization of the official Angular documentation. The next thing I'm going to create is called, actually, a little side file called .bootstrap Rc. What this is another JSON file, really. And what his purpose is to go ahead and configure how Bootstrap is loaded for the Bootstrap loader that we included before. And this is something where I just set it and forget it. And really, I don't vary these except for if I want, since Bootstrap 4 is currently in beta, I'll change this 3 to a 4 or 4 to a 3 as appropriate, just depending on what I want. But really, the rest works okay for both 3 and 4. I just specify the version I like. Okay, this is all boilerplate configuration. We actually kind of want to start to get to a more interesting part. So the next thing we're going to talk about is Webpack. What is Webpack? Webpack essentially, and there's more documentation on the site about what Webpack is, but Webpack basically takes all your JavaScripts, your CSS, and your images, and TypeScripts and JavaScripts, and then mashes them together in one blob. The advantage of this blob is it makes things faster to load and optimizes the end user's experience at the end, cutting off load times, using many different strategies and many different ways to really make things go fast. So we're going to start, and additionally, what Webpack does is it also will allow you a debug session. Instead of blobbing everything, it keeps everything separate, keeps track of stuff, and allows you to track bugs just that much easier. So let's go ahead and get started with our Webpack configuration. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new directory called Webpack, and we're going to create a file there called helpers.js. If you notice, I create a new file, and if I put a slash in there, it automatically creates a directory for me. I find that quite convenient. And here's helpers.js. This is a blatant plagiarization again from Angular. Angular's official documentation had this. And really what this helper does, honestly, if you look at it, it just gives us an unambiguous way of resolving the path and resolving where our document root is. This is going to become very helpful as we continue on our way. Okay, so the helpers is another thing we could just set and forget. Now, the next thing we're going to do, this is a little diversion as well, is to create a little something called target.js. Target.js is a solution we use here, homegrown at Deep Dive, to solve the problem of we have multiple people deploying to multiple destinations, yet we still need the same code base. And so target.js, just simply speaking, will say that this is the URL that we need. And if you notice, this was actually in the getignore Webpack target.js. This is actually getting ignored. It's getting ignored because of, honestly, this. The username per person is going to vary, and then usually this part of it does not. But that discrepancy is enough to warrant a get ignored. And indeed, as you see, PHP Storm is telling me, hey, this is ignored. Why are you editing it? Well, we do need a PHP Storm, but I do appreciate the warning. Honestly, I do. It is a good idea for PHP Storm to warn us there. I'm going to go ahead and manually deploy it and make sure it's going up to my deployment. Now, let's get back to topic. Webpack has a configuration file. We're going to use multiple files to make things easier on us and to make things a little bit more sortable, a little more readable. So first of all, we're going to start with Webpack common. Here's our common configuration. And our common configuration contains a lot. But essentially what it comes down to, here's the important parts. First of all, we're going to load some plugins. Now, once we've loaded the plugins, there's something called entry points. Entry points are important in Webpack because it will process these entry points in the order they appear in the file and look for these files and, like, say, polyfills. Polyfills is going to contain a dependency, and that dependency will contain another dependency, and that dependency will probably contain more dependencies. Webpack is smart enough to continue down and keep on wandering through and exploring through until all the polyfills have been resolved. Same with vendor, same with name, same with app. Now that we've discussed that, we can go ahead and say polyfills is going to be for what I like to call the system requirements of Angular. You can't have Angular without these things. Now, vendor is going to be for something called vendor code. In other words, stuff we didn't write. And that's going to include Angular itself, Bootstrap, Font Awesome, and other things. The next is main.ts. Main.ts is code we wrote. That's fine. And main.ts is the starting point for our Angular code. And finally, app.css is, well, a CSS sheet for the app's stylings. Entry points are important because if you need to add any more JavaScript or any more things, you add it here as an entry point. Then next is the resolution. You want to resolve TypeScript and JavaScript files. If you need to process other files and have Webpack pay attention to those, add them here. The next is the loaders, or the rules and the loaders. And what that is for HTML, we'll use an HTML loader. For these guys, which are image files, we'll use the URL loader. For CSS, we'll use the style loader. And for TypeScript, we'll use the awesome TypeScript loader. And then the next thing is the various plugins. Please notice that we're going to optimize app, vendor, and polyfills in this order. And then the next one is to provide. The provide plugin is really useful if you have a JavaScript library that requires a global variable. Here, this is jQuery, because if you're familiar with jQuery code, you have a dollar followed by a selector, and so that this makes the dollar variable available, and the jQuery variable available, and window.jQuery as well. And we're going to map all these to the jQuery plugin from package.json. And then finally, the HTML Webpack plugin, we're going to inject in the head. We could have injected in the body, we'll inject in the head. And the file name, the output is going to be public HTML index.html. And the input is going to be webpack index.html, which we'll create in a second. This is why we get ignored public HTML index.html, is because Webpack will automatically generate this for us. It does need a template. We're going to add that momentarily. But for now, let's go ahead and put the config up. Okay, now that's our common config. In other words, what Webpack will use for all cases. Now we're going to create two more. This is what's known as our dev config. And dev config is going to be our debug config. And there's not really much to this except for a couple of things. First of all, we're going to what dev config is going to do is that it's going to start a small teensy-weensy web server we're going to be using. And it will be on localhost 7272. It's going to be at port 72. and it will be rooted at public HTML. That's the root of this little mini web server. And we're going to proxy /API. In other words, /API is going to go up to target URL. Now that comes from target.js. If you look at target URL, it's going to go all the way out here and tack on API. TLDR, the big idea here about the proxy is that we want it to, every time we get an API request, go to PHP. This limitation is because Webpack does not support PHP code, and we cannot render PHP code. So we need to actually use the URL here in target.js and say, hey, if I need an API call, I need to go out to here, guys. And that's what that's saying. Good. So there's our development config. Let's try a live config. So here's our live config. So our live config is kind of similar to our dev config. It just specifies some outputs. Except for this time, instead of mapping a little mini web server, it actually just has all these plugins in. Essentially what these plugins do is to go ahead and create code that is immediately accessible from a web browser. It also compresses or minimizes that code from the web browser in order to make it load as fast and as efficient as possible in a live environment. And this is another thing I kind of just went with, and really it's kind of boilerplate for all my projects. Now, for the first time, we're going to go ahead and have a file that actually varies a little bit from project to project. And the amount of boilerplate is going to go down as we continue the screencast. So I'm going to go ahead and add my template index.html. This is going to be the master HTML that's used for the entire project. I like to keep this as plain as possible. I'm going to close the Webpack tabs here. I like to keep this as plain as possible. So we just have a simple doc type, HTML head, some meta tags, the UTF-8, HTTP Quiv, and the viewport Bootstrap kind of needs that. Then we have this inline script. I don't like inline scripts, but it was kind of necessary. This is the only way I can make this thing work. TLDR, what this really does is we have to tell Angular for the purpose of routing where we are on the web server. And this JavaScript solves a little existential crisis of I can't tell you where you are on the web server without being in a browser, and I can't be in a browser without being on the web server. And so this little inline script solves that existential crisis. The reason why it's in a script tag instead of kind of where I like it in a kind of more maintainable JavaScript is essentially Webpack would run this script last, but then it's too late. It needs to run first. And even when it ran first, I got it to run first. It still would not wait for Angular, and we'd have all sorts of errors. And so the only way we could really do it was to just put it into an inline script tag. It came down to a lesser of all evils situation. We have the title tag, head tag, body tag. And here we have the Angular 5 example app tag. You won't find that on MDN. In Angular, it is fun, useful, and really great to amuse your friends with the fact that you can create your own tags. We're going to see where this tag is defined later, but we will use Angular to actually invent our own tags, and this is actually a very useful and awesome thing. Let's go ahead and invent this. One thing to notice here is that we haven't loaded Angular anywhere in any script tags. Webpack is going to take care of that for us, and that's where Webpack is quite convenient. It'll load up Angular, Bootstrap, and everything else without fussing around. So this is, simply speaking, this is the template that Webpack will use to actually generate an actual file. And that's why, again, if you remember, we ignored our index.html, even though that sounds kind of crazy. Yeah, there actually is a method to the madness. Okay, we're now done with Webpack configuration. We can now move on to creating an actual Angular application. And so in order to start Angular, we're going to go ahead and create something called polyfills. Now we need to, everything in Angular is going to be src/something. So in the src directory, we're going to create something called polyfills. Now polyfills basically are just, I like to call them system requirements for Angular itself. And we'll go ahead and paste this in. And notice that's polyfills.ts, not JS. That's Tango Sierra, not Juliet Sierra. So if you have polyfills.js, you're wrong. If you have polyfills.ts, you're right. Let's go ahead and paste this in. By the way, you'll get this message from PHP Storm, compile TypeScript and JavaScript. This is very useful. It really helps in debugging. So yes, definitely say okay on that. I'll go ahead and do that. All right. Now, the polyfills is what I call them, like I said, system requirements. And it really just imports these. I have to gleefully admit, I just plagiarized them from Angular.io and kind of forgot what they meant. But I do know that if you don't have your polyfills loaded first, then Angular won't work. And so I'm just going to go ahead and add that to Git. And there we go. Okay, great. Now the next thing I want to add is a sibling. It's called vendor.ts. Now vendor.ts is where we house code that we did not write. Again, this is pretty boilerplate in terms of the plan for our Angular development. Kind of boring, because all we're importing here is Angular itself. Right here, RxJS for observables. And here you can go ahead and import other things. I'm doing jQuery, Bootstrap, and FontAwesome. If your project has some other sort of package or something else that you're using, feel free to add them here. This is the appropriate place for any other external npm packages. But again, we really haven't gotten into anything too exciting. The excitement will build here, and we're going to actually go to main.ts now. Now, what main.ts is actually the main entry point for your application. And main.ts is the first time when we actually get to kind of carefully consider our application as opposed to consider what does Angular need to load. Now, if you'll notice here, I've got some red. I've got some errors. And I'm willing to put up with it temporarily, but only temporarily so. Now, the first two are coming from I can't find platform browser dynamic or app.module because this thing is from an npm package and this thing is from app.module. App.module is something I need to create. It does not yet exist. And then finally, enable production mode comes from Angular core, and it does not exist. So I think I can squash two of these, and this one won't work. Let's see how. So these come from these two. These guys, they come from our package.json. We have Angular core in here, right? Yeah, there's Angular core, so why is this not working? Well, actually, if you look at PHP Storm, it says you can install these from package.json and run npm install. Now, as much as convenient as this feature is, I actually prefer to use the command line here. So let's go ahead and go to the command line. This is why I said I want you to have two windows open. One local, this would be Git Bash under Windows or Terminal in Mac OS X. And then a second one, this is PuTTY under Windows, or a second tab in Mac OS X. So we can go ahead and do this. We're going to run npm install. npm install, I'm going to go ahead and on both systems run npm install. They take a while. This will especially on Windows, it's a little slower. It'll take a while, so let's just let it go. It'll grab all the packages from here from our package.json and install them and make them available to the project. It's useful to do here on the local side because then PHP Storm has an easier time resolving what these packages are trying to do and can give you better autocomplete and also clean up a lot of errors. Now here on the server side, it's necessary because if you don't npm install, you can't even deploy the site. So one thing you'll notice, I don't know if you notice really fast in the background, PHP Storm kind of, as we did the npm install, kind of updated itself and kind of reinformed itself of what's going on. And now has kind of changed its mind about a few areas. Okay. What I like to do is, as we're going through this boilerplate, we're going to continue to have errors. Now, I have noticed one mistake I have made here, and let me rectify that right now, is that main.ts was actually put in the wrong directory, and so that's why it's kind of having some problems right now. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in my src directory and move them, and move them up. They should be in the src directory, so you may have seen that I'm trying to work some stuff out here. There we go. You may have seen that I created it in the root. I did not mean to do that. I meant to put main.ts here in the src directory. And if you notice, after I did that, actually things started aligning at least a little better. I was actually alerted to that fact that this line and this line used to be errors, and once I moved it, suddenly everything worked. This one is still an error, but that's okay. We're going to take care of it. The point I was about to make before I noticed that error was, as I continue developing my application and continue to expand out past the boilerplate, these errors will go away. And to kind of checklist it, I'll keep all the tabs right here and keep them up while we have errors. And then when errors go away, I can close them. Now, this little block will on the DOM content loaded event, which is known as the ready event in jQuery. On the jQuery ready event, or the DOM content loaded event, will go ahead and load Angular. The reason why we're doing it like this is because of in certain applications we had what was known as a race condition, in which because of what was in the script tag in here, it would load too fast and it would not get the proper routing, and so this purposefully delays Angular from loading just a few milliseconds until everything is ready. And then this just tells Angular to go ahead and load up. So let's go ahead and commit and push this, despite the fact we have this error. We'll push it. Now, before we go any further, we actually have another file here. It's called packagelock.json. Packagelock.json is what's known as a lock file in versioning, which essentially locks or shrink wraps all your packages to a certain version. As you can see, this is a machine-generated file. It's quite a bit. However, for the sake of projects and to prevent incompatibilities or accidental overwrites, you should actually go ahead and add this. So we're going to go ahead and get at it and commit it. This file is automatically generated by an Npm Install or an Npm Update every time you add or modify packages in Npm. And you should definitely commit and push this to Git. It's real important to your project. Even though it's not the code you write, it is something you should definitely have. Back to point. So, the next thing we're going to go ahead and add is our CSS file. We're not going to be doing any CSS here. So I'm going to go ahead and just add my CSS file and commit it blank. With the Webpack templates, if you don't have the CSS file, Webpack will actually crash and complain that the CSS file does not exist. So even if you're not using any special CSS rules, we're just going to be using Bootstrap defaults, you still should have your app.css. Okay, that should complete our boilerplate for that. Now we can actually start delving in creating our actual application now. So our application, our application we're just going to do something basic here for starting screencast. And we're going to start off with app.module because that's an error. So let's try and resolve that error. So all of our application code will go under a directory called app. and it wants something called app.module, so app/app.module, and I'll put the TS extension for TypeScript. Go ahead and add it to Git. And here's our module. So our module, we're going to import Angular module from Angular Core, the HTTP client module from HTTP, the browser module from Platform Browser, and then our app.component and our app.routes, which still does not exist. Like I said, I like to kind of gather up on tabs what's not working and close them as they start to resolve themselves. In fact, main.ts suddenly works now because app.module exists. App.module itself needs some work, but that's okay. We will resolve that momentarily. And so we have an Angular module. We're going to import browser, HTTP, routing. Routing is coming for app.routes. Modulo declarations is just the app.component, and then all app components also comes with routes. And then, of course, we're going to bootstrap the app component. But we'll take this one and then app routing provider. So it's a lot. Let's take it one at a time. Let's go to the app.component. Components are important. Components is pretty much what you're going to be living and dying by. So let's create our first app.component. And that's just going to be a sibling file here. All right. This is called a component. And remember how I said in index.html, in fact, actually, PHP Storm just detected this. This used to be a warning like, oh my God, this tag does not exist. It suddenly exists. Because components allow one to actually create their own tags. And you can see that here in the selector. This is a CSS selector. And in CSS, if you just have a selector with no modifiers, no dot, no hash, nothing like that, that's just a tag. And so essentially what we did, we just created our own tag called Angular 5 example app, as if it's a HTML tag like any other. And PHP Storm picked up on that. This used to be a warning, and now suddenly it's not. And that's the big idea of a component. You can create your own tag with a selector if you'd like. And what goes in that selector? What HTML appears? Well, it's going to be something called template Angular 5 example app.html. We'll take care of that in a sec. So let's just go ahead and leave this open right now. Let me commit one at a time the module and the component. Okay. So, now if you notice back in the module, the app.component now resolves. And app.component itself doesn't have any errors. So we have cleaned up one error from app.module. The final note I'm going to make is that here in app component is in these braces is supposed to be all the code that runs. In our basic component, we're not going to run any code, so we just leave the empty braces and we don't do anything. I can close this. It has no errors. We need app.routes now. Now, app.routes is going to be, for this one, it's going to be very basic because we're not going to use any special routes. But if you do need special routes, which you often will, it's one of the big powers of Angular. One of the wonderful things about Angular is the fact that you can make custom routes and make up URLs that really make no sense. But for now, we're just going to have an application with one route that just does one thing. But the real power is having an application with many routes doing many things. So we're going to import router and router module and routes from the router. And we have splash component user service. These do not exist. We'll create them momentarily, and again, like the other files, as we create things, these errors just resolve themselves. Now there's this little thing called app base href from Angular Common. Let's talk about that for a second. If you look at this line of code right here in our script tag that we kind of hated, it says window base ref is assigned to base path. Keep that in mind. And that app base ref is the focal point for the router. The router has to come to a focal point. And so we're going to provide app base ref and use value window base ref, just the way window base ref is here. And so essentially what this script is doing is establishing and leaving a hint for Angular. This is leaving a hint for Angular. And then here's Angular taking the hint, picking up on the hint and saying that, hey, okay, that script tag told me where the focal point of the router is, and so I'm going to take that hint. And that's what app-based-ref really is. Read the Angular documentation if you wish to know more. I didn't make up this variable name. It comes from Angular itself. Back to point. So the rest that we need to manage and create here is the components that we need. And we're just going to have one component called splash component. And the services we need. We have one service called user service. Components, kind of like the main component, is just little pieces of our Angular application that we can continue to piece together to make a complete application. Every route and everything you wish to express is a component. Services are a way of connecting to data. You can connect to your own data, and that's an internal service, or you can connect to other people's data, as we will in this example, and that's an external service. The neat thing in Angular is that Angular is not really concerned as to whether it's internal or external. Angular is just concerned of how do you connect to it. And if it's internal or external, Angular is ready to connect and good to go. So actually, the next layer that I wish to talk about is the service itself. So let's actually go ahead and jump off there to try and resolve these errors. Again, if you notice here, app.component or app.module has resolved all its errors. I'll close that tab now. I'll go ahead and commit app.routes, and let's go ahead and continue. Now, this is the point where we can really celebrate that we really have gotten beyond pure boilerplate, and now we get to talk about the application we're excited to build as opposed to setting up Angular. Angular is set up, honestly. Angular's there, Webpack's there. Everything is ready for us to actually build a great app. And now we don't have to worry about boilerplate. Angular, Fun Awesome, and Bootstrap are in place. We just have to use them now. So let's go ahead and build out the service layer and bubble up into the front end. That's the strategy I prefer to use. Now, some people prefer to use the opposite strategy of building up the front end and digging down into the service level, to which I say that's fine. Both approaches are valid. Do you prefer to go from bubble up or dig down? As long as you do it correctly, both are fine. We're going to bubble up here, though. So I'm going to go ahead and create my user service. Now, a service uses Angular's HTTP AJAX capabilities to connect to an HTTP service, whether it's internal or external. So I'm going to create a user service. And in this case, we don't have enough time to build out an entire internal service. Internal services are covered in other parts of the curriculum and are not a part of the screencast. So I'm going to choose to use an external service from something called JSON Placeholder, which is a developer service that has various typical kind of classes that you can use to develop applications without having to worry to develop and curate your own data. So we're going to import HTTP client. This is the HTTP runner for Angular. Angular will go ahead and connect to the service using this. Injectable, this is from the dependency injection design pattern from Game 4. This is essentially saying, Angular, I want you to have a look at this object, and every time somebody needs a user service, please give it to them free of charge. And then observable. Observable is basically a way of making a latent if and observing something that might be slow because maybe the connection here might be a little slower, or even if it's not slow visibly to the user, it is slow relative to Angular itself, because Angular on an internal connection can immediately connect to itself, but connecting to this JSON placeholder website is going to be several hundred milliseconds slower. And observable allows us to take decisions based on these slower operations. The next thing is we need a user class. We don't have that. We'll create that right now. So the user class is going to be a very generic container for the possible results of anything we put to the JSON placeholder. Now, if you look at the documentation with the JSON placeholder, actually there's a lot of things, but we're just going to do a few things because it's very complicated. So we're going to have a public ID that's a number, an email is a string, a phone is a string, and a name is a string. So we're just going to really be concerned with those things. Generally speaking, these classes will be a direct reflection of your of the classes you write in PHP. In this case, since there's no PHP classes and we're just using external data, we will follow that pattern and just reflect the state variables that we want to map. And notice this is just a constructor and it's empty. That's the miracle of Angular. Angular, you just need to tell it in the constructor what you need, and that's all it ever needed to know about. So, okay, if you notice, the errors have resolved here, and now we can look at the user class. Now, the user class just needs the HTTP runner, which is HTTP client right here. And notice, that's it. We don't need to do anything special. This is kind of actually a good illustration of injectable. The HTTP client itself is injectable, and we're injecting it here, and that's all that needs to be done for the user service. And so the user service, in other words, injects the HTTP client, which will be injected into components. So user service is actually the middleware. It's actually the middle of this whereas HTTP client is kind of the left side. It's going to inject into user service, and then we'll see how we're going to inject user service into something else. And so that's why this is kind of called middleware. And so we have this private user URL, just a URL, just kind of a way to keep that URL dry. Now we get all users. This is going to return an observable of an array of users. How many users can we get? We can get many. And we're going to observe that. We observe that because this URL could be fast or slow. And even if it is fast to the end user, it's slow to Angular at all times. And we're going to return this HTTP get. So we're going to get an array of users from the URL. That's really all we need, and our service is complete. All right. So let's have a look at our app.routes. App.routes, user.service is cleaned up. Now we need our splash component. So what's that all about? Now the splash.component is going to be the main DOM, the main HTML for our application. So in this component, what do we have? Okay. Remember how I said that errors should resolve themselves once you have everything correct. Again, I have committed a directory level sin. I need to have this in a directory called components, and I didn't have it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a directory. You can go ahead and drag this in. Move those files as well. Yes. And notice how the errors just resolve themselves. Please be careful about pathing. And if you notice these pathing errors, just correct them immediately before moving on. It's real important you do that. So, also, if you notice now that the component exists, app.routes has resolved itself, and so there's no mistakes there. We're nearly done, really. Okay, so we're going to import component and on-init from Angular Core. And then user from the user class, we just created that, and user service, we just created that. So our component has just the template URL, and it doesn't have a selector like it had in the app.component, so what it gives. Going back to the app.routes, here's the fun part, is that notice we had, and I kind of glossed over this so I can come back later, so we have the path of empty string with the component of splash component. So what it essentially comes down to is that every route will have a component, and Angular will automatically swap that route in. Of course, in this example application, we only have one route, but imagine if we had a handful, a dozen, a few, or even dozens and dozens of routes. We need a component for each. And so that's the power of Angular again, is the ability to make up these fake URLs and these fake routes. So that's why we don't need a selector here, is because the router will automatically swap it in for us. So here's our splash component implements on-init. On-init is a contract that kind of roughly equivalent to jQuery's ready event, or the DOM content loaded event that we saw earlier, except for it's an Angular event that happens after Angular is ready. The difference is that the DOM content loaded event is when the HTML is ready from the browser. The onInit event is when Angular is ready, because Angular does have some load time. Angular has some time in which it needs to boot up. Once Angular's boot up, onInit is the first thing Angular does. In terms of load time, that's important. Okay, so we're going to implement onInit. So when we implement onInit, there's going to be a contract that says that once Angular has fired, we need to do something. We'll see that something in just a second. But first we have a state variable, which is an array of users. And that's what this is. So an array of users is an array of users, and it's assigned to empty array. This is just a placeholder. The onInit that we're about to use actually is going to fill this array, but we just, as a placeholder, as a start point, as a 0, we put it to empty array. So the constructor is going to inject the user service. I told you that we could inject services or anything that's injectable because the HTTP client itself is injectable. It's injected in the user service. Now the user service can be injected here. And this is how we inject it. It's the same way. See, we injected the HTTP client into the user service as well. So here we go. We inject the user service. Now Angular onInit. Angular onInit will say this user service get all users. Again, going back to the user service here, get all users returns an observable of an array of users, and it'll observe that. That's all it does. Now the observable is kind of the outlet. We have to plug something in, and that's what the component is. The component is the actual thing that we plug in, the thing we're interested in using. Because an outlet by itself is no good. Stick your finger into it, you get shocked. So, this user service get all users. We're going to go to the user service get all users, and the subscribe method is actually what we're plugging in. So, the subscribe method means we're going to get all users and we're going to wait. And wait. And wait. And wait. And wait. Until the service returns and we get users. And this is what's known as fat arrow. Yeah, it's called fat arrow. So the users received from the service, we're going to say this users is assigned to users. It's basically saying, whatever we get, whatever we receive from the service, let's go ahead and store it in this little users array. And that loads our array. And this little bit of magic will take the stuff from the service and immediately store it in this array for later use in the DOM. And so let's go ahead and commit that. Whew, so far so good, right? The good news here is that we have all our Angular code written. So our Angular app should work, right? Well, not so fast. We're pretty much there, but there's one key thing we're missing. We're doing a website. We haven't hardly done a single line of HTML. Let's go ahead and fix that one. So I'll go ahead and collapse this. We really don't need the src directory or the webpack directory. I just need to create our templates. Now our templates were actually alluded to in both components. And there we go. Here's our Angular 5 example app. In app.component, we said templates Angular 5 example app.html. Again, before committing, I have actually put this in the wrong directory, so I'm going to go ahead and create a directory called templates here, and then drag this thing in. Again, be careful about pathing. Okay, now that I've fixed that, templates Angular 5 example app.html. Public HTML templates. Angular 5 example app.html. The important thing about this template URL is the fact that the public HTML is left off, because public HTML is implicitly the root, and we just kind of cut that off, and anything below that is what the browser will see. And so that's why it's simply templates instead of public HTML templates. We have Angular 5 example app.html. So now let's have a look at the HTML. It's incredibly complex, right? Right? Wrong. Okay, so we have main class container that comes from Bootstrap. I've got an h1 tag here. I love to start off my templates with h1 tags. It's so much better, so much easier, so much cleaner. The reason for this is it makes it so much easier to debug your routes, especially when you have a lot of routes. And as you go from 2 to 4 to 17 to 11 billion routes in your app.routes, it becomes so much easier to manage if you can just prove them with an h1. Now the next thing is a special tag called router outlet. Router outlet is the Angular router is going to look for this tag, and every time a route is encountered, it will fill in this tag with the actual route it found. Again, here, all we have is one possible route in the splash component that we already made. And in more complicated ones, this is where the power comes in, is that essentially what I've enabled myself to do is create kind of a site-wide container for everything, and then just put a router outlet everywhere I want. But let's zoom out just a second. If we go to Webpack index.html, here's our HTML, and then we have this tag here. Notice this Angular 5 example app, and haha, Angular 5 example app is here. So in other words, what Angular is going to do is going to delete this junk and then put this in here. And get used to that. This I call it div swapping. It's just going to swap out this and swap it in for this. With router outlet, it's just one more layer of swapping. Okay, now that we have that ready, let's go ahead and get our last template up. After all this, we seriously only have one more file to create. But let's create this one a little slower. So I'm going to create it. It's called splash.html because in the splash component, we actually advertised templates splash.html. Okay, fine. And instead of creating it all at once, I'm going to go ahead and just put an h1 called splash component. Before we put anything fancy, we're just going to go ahead and do this first run with just, I'll call it an h2 tag. We already have an h1 here, so let's call it an h2. So with this h2, let's just see what we have. And again, I'll commit and push that. Beautiful. Now that we've done all this and we've spun all this up, we can actually start to see some tangible results. I bet you can't wait. I know I can't. So we're going to come back to our to the local. Let's worry about the server later. Keep the SSH session open, but we're going to go ahead and type Npm Start. And what this does is it runs Webpack in a special mode, in a debug mode. Now, Webpack will go ahead and build and compile everything and get everything ready for us. And it runs a mini web server on, as it says right here, this right here, localhost 7272. So all we need to do is type or copy that address into our browser to begin testing. Make sure that there's no red here. Webpack's a little chatty. There's a lot of little a little back and forth and a lot of outputs. Essentially, errors will appear in red. We don't have any errors here. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new tab here and go to my little Angular 5 example, and there we have our splash component. Now I know things are working. We're validated now. I know that things actually work. Now, we want to get some data up on this page. If you actually go to the URL provided in the example service, you'll find some data, and it looks something like this. This is a big blob of JSON, and as you can see, there is an ID, a name, an email, and a phone for each user. There's also quite a bit more, but for the sake of simplicity, I ignored it in this small little starter app. But as you can see, there's 10 users in this table, and there's 10 users in this blob. So let's use Angular to go from this to something an end user could easily read and digest. So let's go ahead and write out a nice little table for the user to read. So table. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and put is my headers. And if I reload here, I see my headers. I don't see any data yet, but we will. So now that I have my headers, I'm going to go ahead and create another row. But now I'm going to do something a little different. If you notice, actually, there's plenty of things with the Angular logo here that PHP Storm is prompting me for. I'm going to use something called Angular for. Angular for is Angular's for each loop. It will go across an array for as many times as there are elements in the array. So if there's 10 elements, like this case, we get 10. If there's 78 results, we get 78. And if there's 3, there's 3. And inside the Angular for is a standard ES6 JavaScript construct of let, a variable of an array. The important thing is that this array must, absolutely must, without question, without doubt, exist here. And we do have a state variable called users. And if you don't have a state variable called users, this will not work. This variable is for your convenience. You can name it anything sensical, anything logical. And here we go. So I'll go ahead and type this out. Now this brace notation, also known as handlebar notation, this brace notation is a placeholder for Angular to fill in. It's a blank. The user has an ID. We know this because when we wrote the class, we have an ID, an email, a phone, and a name. And again, this is just a blank. And Angular will fill in the blanks. So let's provide Angular with a few more blanks to fill in. And you might be thinking to yourself, it's not that easy, is it? Well, bad news for you. It is that easy. Look at that. Now, from that data set, from here, I've gone to here. Now, let me demonstrate one more thing before we close the screencast, which is, wouldn't it be nice if I could click on these email and actually start emailing the people? What we need is a link. Now, for those of you who are not familiar, in order to create an email-enabled link, it has to be something called a mail-to link, which really isn't that difficult. You just have to know about it. Here on MDN, you can find an explanation when they talk about the A tag, and you come down here, and your email links have to look like this. A, href, mail to, and then wherever you want to send an email. And that has to be in your A tag. Back to Angular. Okay. So one might think, okay, I'll put a href, mail to user.email. Let's go ahead and do that. That sounds great. And I'll just close the A tag, and we should have the email links. Go ahead and reload. The application. Ta-da! Except for wait. If you look closely in the lower left, it's user.email all the way down. It does not say sincere at april.biz like it should, or shana at melissa.tv the way it should. Something's not quite right. This is where we get into something called a one-way bind. One-way binding in Angular is a way of taking data and throwing it in a one-way direction into the DOM or onto an A tag or into a P tag or whatever. So to do a one-way bind, you just put a box around the attribute you want to bind on. Okay, now PHP Storm is kind of worried because this is not exactly what PHP Storm expects, but that's okay. So this is not quite syntactically right, and that's what the yellow is all about. So just for a moment, to make it syntactically correct but not semantically correct, I'm going to take this away and make it just user.email and see what happens. Reload. And when we reload, it kind of works if you look carefully at the URL down below in the lower left. It goes to localhost 7272/sincere@april.biz. In other words, it is binding, but it's going to the host and not to the email. Again, coming back to what MDN wants us to do, we have to put mail to in front of it. That's where a little JavaScript comes in handy. Much better now. Now what we have is the string mail to right here. The string mail to concatenated with the actual user email. And voila. Now we have exactly what we want. And if we click on any of these, we're going to start emailing those people and sending email like we want it to. This is the power of what is, again, known as a one-way bind. You use the box here. Use the box here to inject Angular data like user.email into what normally would be static data. And you can combine static data by, in this case, we use the concatenation operator. Now we can have our final splash screen. Very well. There's only one more thing to do now. Our app is complete. It works in our little test server, localhost 7272. But localhost 7272, if we go to our deployment URL, we're going to be sorely disappointed because here's our deployment URL. This makes no sense. And even if we go to the public HTML directly like we're supposed to, it's empty. We see the templates maybe, but nothing beyond that. So, in order to make an Angular application live, we just do npm run build. And this process takes a while. The npm run build takes longer than than the test environment does. The test environment just gets things up and leaves things in a test mode, which honestly takes a lot less time. And so this is going to take a little more time, but it's optimized for delivery to an end user's deployment. And it will load much faster and much better than the test deployment does. Now, we can see right here what it did. And again, this is kind of chatty. There's going to be a lot here. Don't worry about it unless you get a bunch of red errors. I got a few little warnings here, but that's nothing I can do. As you can see, it's not from my code, so I'm not too concerned. And if we reload, done. Look at us. Now, this can be loaded in a browser without the need for dev tools, without the need for a debugging environment. It can be handed directly to an end user, and they would be able to immediately discern its purpose and use the app straight away. And that's exactly what we want. Again, this is our test environment. Its use case is for developing code, and when you open up DevTools, if you have any errors, it will show you the errors. This is for the live environment, and if you open up DevTools, it's going to be quite indecipherable and be quite candid. But that's what this is for. Debug here first, and then go here last. So, by watching this video, you have learned how to spin up an Angular 5 app, how to use Webpack, and how to use an API to grab data and display it on a page using a service.